Let me welcome all our audience, all chapter members to this first NMGS Ibadan quarterly webinar series. This particular webinar series is supposed to be a quarterly series hosted by Ibadan chapter of the Nigerian Mining and Geosciences Society. For those who are, especially our guests, NMGS is the umbrella body for all the geoscientists, the mining engineers, the petroleum geologists, the geophysicists, and what have you within the country that are specializing in the field of geology in all their field of endeavor. Now, why are we doing this? Why are we having this quarterly webinar series? One, we want to promote the interest of the earth sciences and then stimulate intellectual discussion among members on key geoscientific contemporary issues by renowned scholars from all over the world. And you agree with me that our guest speaker of today is a renowned one. It's all the way from Netherlands. Our vice chairman will be doing justice to that. We also want to encourage an exchange of ideas between experts in different fields of earth sciences and people interested in gaining deeper knowledge in a broad array of topics. Then we are trying to bridge the lacuna created by current events shaping our world in the area of knowledge transfer. You will agree that most of us that want to go for international conference and what have you all around us. So we want to bridge that lacuna to the area of knowledge transfer, understanding and sharing of current trends in research findings, which can be beneficial to geoscientists and mining engineers. So today, we are starting with this first webinar, and we have our guest in the house. And the guest speaker will be addressing us on the drivers and consequences of land subsidence in deltas and coastal areas around the world. So I will invite the vice chairman, who is the committee chair for this NMGS Ibadan quarterly webinar series, Dr. to please introduce our guest speaker. Vice chairman, you are home.
Thank you very much, my chairman, for that brief introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for creating time to attend today's lecture. But before we introduce our guest lecturer for today, I quickly want to brief us about today's webinar. The topic, just like our chairman have rightly said, is drivers and consequences of land subsidence in deltas and coastal areas around the world. And the talk is going to be for 40 minutes, and after which there's going to be question and answer for 10 minutes. And if you would like to ask a question, kindly submit it using the chat function in Zoom, and it will be attended to at the end of the presentation. And if you feel like asking directly, kindly signify by clicking the raise hand button. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to introduce to us Dr. Philip S.J. Minderhoud, who is our first guest lecturer for the NMGS Ibadan quarterly webinar series. Dr. Philip Minderhoud is a distinguished scholar and assistant professor at the University of Wageningen, the Netherlands, and a Marie Curie research fellow at the University of Padova, Italy. He is also an advisor to DeltaRes, a Dutch independent institute for applied research in the field of water, subsurface, and infrastructure. Philip is specialized in land subsidence and relative sea level rise of coastal deltaic areas, connecting the fields of geology, hydrogeology, geotechnical engineering, and remote sensing. He has worked extensively on big delta, such as the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Pole, and the Mississippi. Philip is involved in impact-oriented research, aiming to create awareness and collaborative research uptake, and is actively engaging with policymakers and NGOs to develop strategies to cope with ongoing land subsidence and accelerated sea level rise around the world. Philip is a co-leader of a larger project called ENGulf, that is Coastal Land Subsidence in the Gulf of Guinea. And ENGulf is a 2-year project with the primary objective to study subsidence at different hotspots along the Gulf of Guinea, including Lagos, Nigeria. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome Dr. Minderhoud for his presentation. Philip, thank you for honoring this invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olugusun, for this very kind introduction. Hi, everyone. I'll try to share my screen. Let me see. It says I cannot share yet because someone else is sharing the screen at the moment. Okay. Should be able to share it. Please confirm that you see my screen.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. And also thank you very much for this this great invitation to speak to you at this webinar series. And I'm looking very much forward also to discuss with you afterwards and exchange ideas on the following. As already mentioned in the introduction, in this talk I will go into details on land subsidence in deltas and coastal areas around the world, and with some specific cases that we're going to zoom in. See, there we go. So first, let's start with the definition of land subsidence. So land subsidence is the lowering of a land surface, and it takes place by processes that are happening in the subsurface, and it's always relative to a certain level. And in the case that we're interested in coastal land subsidence, this is often the sea level. And on the right-hand side, you can see this image where we see 9 meters of land subsidence that happened since the 19th century, 1925. And this is in the San Juan Valley in California, USA. And this valley was actually lost more than 9 meters of elevation because of agricultural practices. And especially in this case, the extraction of groundwater. I hear a bit of noise in the background. If you could mute your mic, that would be it would be great. Thank you. So we're going to look to the coastal part of the land, mainly in this talk. So to get everyone on the same page, but I assume that this is a familiar ground for a lot of you. First, let's see what is a delta. So a delta is new land that is formed when a river enters a body of water, for example, the sea, and it creates new land by deposition of sediments. And these deltas are very valuable. They're densely populated. Worldwide, more than 500 million people live in these areas. They're abundant resources, resource-rich, fertile lands, high biodiversity, and also high economic values. And are crucial for the food security in a lot of regions in the world. I still hear a bit of noise sometimes. And maybe, Olugusun, you can also, I think, mute some of the participants yourself as the admin. Thanks.
So now let's say kind of postgraduate school, you want to go inside there, you now try it.
What would you do in postgraduate school?
Postgraduate
Well, it's just for documentation now. You don't take your lectures or your
Sheriff Yusuf, could you mute your mic, please?
But what I'm trying to do is,
okay.
Thank you. So we have a lot of changes in deltas and coastal areas around the world. And here we see a coastal zone in its natural setting. And then when humans start to occupy these areas, they tend to create a lot of changes. For example, they change the land use, agriculture, they start building cities, and these cities are growing and growing, and they start using the natural resources such as groundwater extraction. Also in the upstream domain, there's a reduction of discharge and sediments by dams, for example, of the rivers toward these deltas. And there's mining of sand in the channels itself. And on top of that, as we all know, the climate is changing. And the combination of all these forces in these deltas, they cause an increase of the amount of flooding that is happening, salinization in the surface water, coastal flooding, coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion also in the groundwater. And if you pump a lot, you will also create more upconing of the saline water. And as we all know, the sea levels are rising globally because of global warming. But these deltas themselves, they're not stable. So they also tend to sink and lose elevation. And this can be actually quite significant. And together, these two, so sea level rise and land subsidence, is what we call relative sea level rise. So this is what we experience when you're standing at the coastline and you just view, let's say, the water with respect to the level of land. Here we are, we see several delta systems around the world, big delta systems, and in color is the elevation. And the warmer the elevation, the more red, the lower the elevation with respect to sea or even below sea level. And you can see that a lot of these deltas are in this red zone, so very lowly elevated. And this makes deltas very delicate environments. So they're very sensitive to changes in their environment by climate change or humans. And the elevation of these deltas is key, because the low elevation means that small changes can already have large consequences and impacts. So let's have a look what can cause land subsidence in a delta or a coastal zone. So first of all, land subsidence is a natural process, as you all probably know. And it can be caused by natural loading, by new sediments, creating compaction in the shallow subsurface, but also deep-rooted, more hard rock-based processes such as tectonic movements, isostasy, and earth crust mantle dynamics. Then when humans start to build stuff, for example, on top of the surface, they create additional loading by infrastructure, buildings, and constructions. But also, for example, by draining the surface water level, so lowering the surface water table, you create processes, especially in the shallow part, that can cause compaction. And of course, the extraction of fluids. Could be groundwater, could be hydrocarbons. When you take out fluids, you decrease the pressure, and that can cause consolidation as well. And we see that subsidence rates from human-induced processes, they tend to be much faster and outpace these natural induced processes. And what we're looking at is actually a very, let's say, complex puzzle, because we can measure, for example, the total land subsidence by using satellites or using surface measurements. And then we have to try to unravel where in the depth is this happening, what are the causal processes, and how do they connect to the different drivers. And this also changes, in 3D, but it also changes in time. So there's actually a 4D, fourth dimension to this issue, and we'll talk about that more in the remainder of this talk. So subsidence can be very highly variable, both in time and space. So I'd like to show you first this. This is from my own country, the Netherlands. And on the left-hand side, we see a map of the total amount of land subsidence that happened in the Netherlands in the last, let's say, millennium. You can see really in the western side of the country, large parts have lost over 5, 6, 7, 8 meters of elevation, as is depicted, for example, in this cartoon in the middle. In the Netherlands, most of the compaction happens in the shallow parts. It's oxidation of very organic rich peats. So it's caused by especially drainage and harvesting the peat that actually placed most of the Netherlands below sea level now. So it's not sea level rise that created the parts that are below sea level, but it's actually land subsidence. And here we see an example quite more, let's say, recent land subsidence. This is a bunker that was constructed in the 1930s. And as you can see, that the present day surface level is more than a tall guy, lower than it was back then. So land subsidence is actually threatening deltas on a global scale. So here we have an overview of some deltas where we have, let's say, satellite measured deformations. One of them, I think, most interestingly for this talk is, of course, let's say, an INSAR study on the city of Lagos. It's a bit of an older one, but there's more recent ones as well. And if you look to the different rates, they can go up to really high rates. So we even see, if we go towards Asia, we see rates that go in several decimeters or beyond a decimeter per year. And actually today, if we look to the global experience relative sea level rise, I'm sorry, there's some noise by the coffee maker. Quiet down in a few seconds. So the majority of the global relative sea level rise that humans living around the coast are experiencing is caused at present by land subsidence and not by global induced sea level rise. So actually, at the moment, the problem of sea level rise worldwide is dominated by land subsidence rather than climate change. And a lot of cities also around the world, they are experiencing land subsidence. And this is only, let's say, a selection of several, but you can see that really everywhere we have these cities that are sinking. And I think we have to really improve on this map because there's much more cities lacking. For example, I don't see anyone in Africa at this moment. So this is future work that we have to work on. Let's look at some interesting historic places that have experienced in the past. So here we see the trajectories of elevation of several cities around the world. And we can see here, for example, the line of Tokyo, the elevation of Tokyo. So Tokyo lost more than 4 meters since the 1900s. And you can see here the relation of the land subsidence and the groundwater level. So when the groundwater pumping was stopped, and actually the groundwater levels were improving over time again, the recharge was allowed, we can see that the city stopped sinking. So it lost 4 meters before it was stopped sinking. Another example here, we see land subsidence in the city of Jakarta, which you may have heard about as well, because recently also again in the news. So the city lost some places several meters in the last decades. So really high rates of land subsidence happened in Jakarta, and this is mainly focused on the extraction of groundwater. For example, this is a former rice field that was just outside the outskirts of Jakarta. And you can see it's now completely inundated and it's even polluted, so it cannot be used anymore, even for farming of, for example, fish. This is an apartment building that was built only 20 years back, and now it's completely inundated and people had to move out. There's just one brave soul still living up there. But it's really sad to see this happening. And for example, here we see the seawall that is protecting the city from the sea. And as you can see, the water is standing more than 2 meters higher than the road and the suburb, let's say, on the right side of this wall. And it's a very strikingly thin wall, I would say. So imagine if I don't know, this wall would break at some point or a truck would crash into it. It would literally mean the whole sea would flow into the city. And from time to time, this also happens. So they have huge floods that cause deaths and people to displace. And we see the same wall being overtopped by simply a high tide in this case. And also Jakarta now decided to move the capital to a different island because the situation in the city is so hard to maintain. But of course, maybe the administrative part will move, but many of the millions of people who live there, they will not move. So it will still remain a very difficult situation and very tragic for the people who cannot move out. So in the last years, since 2014, we've worked a lot in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. And this is one of the largest deltas that we have on the planet, the third largest. And it's densely populated, important for food production, and also very lowly elevated, as you can see on the right-hand elevation model. Large parts of this delta are actually elevated less than 1 meter above local mean sea level. So it means it's extremely vulnerable to sea level rise and of course also to land subsidence. And if you are in this delta and you would travel around, you can see this kind of evidence, and maybe you also know this from your own experience, from your own place where you live, but this is typical, let's say, evidence that things are happening in the subsurface, as you can imagine. So these cracks between bridges that are found at a certain depth and these roads leading up to them, which are unfounded. And this shows that there's some shallow compaction happening. But there's also evidence of deeper rooted processes. For example, these are groundwater extraction wells that are sticking out of the ground, and they're actually founded at the depth of their filters. So this can be several hundreds of meters of depth. So they function as some sort of a benchmark. So you can find these relics, while, let's say, everything else in the delta sinks, but these are the only relics that are based at a certain, let's say, more stable foundation depth. So here we see the original delta surface, and here we see the present day surface, for example. So there's clearly subsidence happening in this delta, but what is exactly causing it, and what does the future hold? So this is what we started to work on when we arrived in the delta, because hardly anything was known on land subsidence at that moment. So here we have this diagram again, and we're going to look at 3 different aspects. We're going to look at the natural compaction happening in the delta, then the effect of human impacts, and we're going to zoom into the extraction of groundwater. So first of all, it's very important to realize that these deltas are actually very young landforms. They're formed in the second half of the Holocene, and really great, let's say, since the sea level reaches the present day highs, then these deltas were formed by sediment input from rivers. In case of the Mekong Delta, let's say 7,000 years back, the delta did not exist as it is right now, because the coastline was all the way up in present-day Cambodia. So it formed this delta in a few thousands of years with more than 200-300 kilometers of land. So it's really a young landform. And as you can imagine, these young sediments, they compact because of natural consolidation. And also really high rates of natural compaction have been measured at the southern tip of the delta for the top 20 meters. So we see, and when we saw these measurements, they were quite unprecedented, of several centimeters per year in the top, in areas that were actually hardly experiencing any human disturbance. So this took our attention. So what we tried to see if we could explain this from, let's say, the evolution of this delta. So especially in the south, when we have this transect, we have these Holocene deposits sitting on top of more older and more compacted Pleistocene deposits, and we know how fast they have been, let's say, this delta aggregated into this relatively shallow sea. So what we did is we used that and we created a computer model. This was when we still had it in 2D. Currently, we have it even in 3D. We are working on that right now. But with this 2D model, we could simulate this progradation of this delta. It's a finite element geomechanical model, so it accounts for groundwater flow, but also geomechanical deformation of the mesh, but also of all the parameters. And with this, we can simulate the amount of natural compaction happening with this, let's say, deposition and gradually burying of these sediments. And we see that these paleo coastlines that used to be the surface, they are now situated several meters, up to even 10 meters below the present surface, simply because of natural compaction. We could create a map for the entire delta based on Holocene clay, let's say, presence. And actually, when we are really at the tips, at the far end of this young delta, at the coastline, these kind of natural compaction rates can actually be achieved if you have such a fast progression of fine-grained sediments. So yes, when you have such a large delta, it can have really high, unexpectedly high, maybe natural compaction rates. Well, in this case, there's still quite some sediment available in most places. So it means that actually they're not losing elevation because they can gain by new sediments, but the amount of compaction is happening in these rates. But imagine if you would completely cut down on this sediment input, this would be the actual rate of elevation loss. Because natural compaction cannot be stopped, and you need that new sediment input to compensate. We also looked at the impact of humans and land use on land subsidence. So we took some subsidence measurements from satellite that were produced by Stanford University in 2014. And we produced a series of land use and land use change maps that you can see on the right-hand side. And when we overlay these two, we actually find this relation between different land use types and different average land subsidence rates. And in this diagram is also listed the drivers that are connected to human-induced land subsidence. And I will talk you through this figure. So from left to right, we see an increase of these human-induced subsidence drivers for each of these different land use classes. On the left side, these are two land use classes, marshland, wetland, forest, that are natural. So these actually have also the lowest land subsidence rates. And these are all agricultural classes, so they have an increasing trend in land subsidence. And then on the right-hand side, we see the urban classes, so the cities that tend to sink fastest, also what we know from experience, and you can see them clearly on such a satellite map as well. And here we have an outlier, which are the mangroves, but actually we can completely understand that because these mangroves are situated along the coastline. You can see it here in the land use maps on the right side, these green patches are the mangroves. So they experience these high natural compaction rates. So we see higher land subsidence rates with more human activities. So clearly humans are causing land subsidence in this delta. Now let's have a look to this driver, the extraction of groundwater, which we know from examples around the world can be, let's say, the main contributor to really high rates of land subsidence. So land use and groundwater extraction in the Mekong Delta. Well, this delta is used for a lot of production, for example, rice, vegetable farms on higher sand ridges, fruit farms on islands in the river, fish farms in the upstream domain where the delta has a lot of fresh water, and an increasing amount of shrimp farms in the downstream domain, also taking over rice fields, etc. And on top of that, there's a lot of high development in the delta, so there's an increasing amount of industrial and domestic groundwater use. And here we see the amount of groundwater use in the delta. And we really see this tremendous increase from the 1990s, hardly any extraction. And then from the 2000s, this increase really started. So pumping really, the pumps are really turned on, so to say, and really fueling the development of this delta. So where does this water come from? This water comes from the aquifer system that underlies these deltas. So this is basically a stack of all deltas being deposited there in times before. And it's unconsolidated sediments until bedrock that reach thicknesses up to more than 500 meters thick. So more than half a kilometer of unconsolidated sediments are being, let's say, exploited for groundwater. And of course they can compact. And then here we see monitoring wells in one of the sites. So these are different aquifers at different depths, and their groundwater, observed hydraulic head groundwater levels in these confined aquifers. And actually the blue line on top that doesn't really show a decline is the unconfined aquifer that is connected to the surface water. So we see the seasonality of dry and wet season, but we don't really see a decline, maybe towards the end, but not really. But then the other aquifers, we see this really clear trend of decreasing water pressure. And of course, this is driven by this increase in groundwater extraction. Well, when we see this decrease in pressure, we know that this can cause compaction of the aquifer system. And this compaction especially happens not in the sand, so the water is extracted from the sand, but especially in the clays and the silts, the aquitarchs that are interconnected between the sands. Because what happens is that the structure of these aquitarchs, the skeleton of these let's say clay plates, they start to rearrange and they reduce in the amount of pore space that causes a lower volume. And this causes compaction of the system. Well, part of this compaction is recoverable, what we call the elastic part of the deformation, and part is inelastic, is not recoverable and therefore permanent. And what we see in these kind of systems is that generally the permanent part of deformation is much larger than the elastic deformation. So you talk about maybe 10% tops of the amount of elastic deformation taking place. So most of it is really irreversible. Well, you can compare it. This is what I show students, for example. Sometimes you can compare it with plates in a sink. So this is the natural deposition of plates, right? A lot of pore space. And then when you do the dishes, it's much more aligned and you actually are able to fit it nicely into a cupboard. So the reorientation of plates creates a reduction of pore space. And I'm going to try to run this video. Please let me know if it works, because sometimes it's slow with connection.
Mekong Delta is one of the largest deltas in the world. It's inhabited by about 20 million people, and it's reduced from 200. The Mekong Delta is subsiding, but the amount of subsidence and exact causes of subsidence are still unknown. What we see is that there's a very high increase in groundwater use, and we know that excessive groundwater use can cause land subsidence. The question is how much land subsidence is actually caused by the increase of groundwater use over the past 25 years. We built a large 3D hydrogeological model of the Mekong Delta, in which we can simulate the groundwater use and extraction of the past 25 years. And we use that simulation to calculate the amount of land subsidence caused by this groundwater extraction. On the left side, we see the hydrogeology.
Hello, Dr. Dada. It's like the audio has changed. Let him be noted.
Can you still hear the audio?
Hi, Philip. Please, can you increase the audio?
Let me try.
Yeah, please. Thanks. Yeah.
It seems to be at max volume. Can you hear it a bit, or is it really not loud enough?
No,
It's okay now. It's okay
I think
now.
it's okay. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, I'll try, and I'll share the link to the video online if you like. So.
It's a nice example of what happens when
Okay, thank you.
extracting groundwater. So this used to be the old surface when the well was built here. And now we see that the surface level is at least 30 centimeters lower. At the start of the mooring period, the hydrogeological situation of the delta was actually in a rather undisturbed state. And if you talk about land subsidence caused by groundwater extraction, there wasn't hardly any of that 25 years ago. With the high subsidence rates that we see at present, the delta will get more vulnerable to flooding, salinization in the surface water and in the groundwater. And this pressure on the agricultural system in the delta, but also, of course, on the livelihood that people live. During our trips in Vietnam, we closely work together with our Vietnamese partners and co-researchers. And I think the joint effort in order to save the delta from real ground.
Okay, I hope you could follow it a bit, and otherwise I will post the link later, so you can watch it again if you like.
You will post the link later after the lecture. Thank you.
Yes, I will do that. It's right here, and it will be in there. I assume that the PowerPoint would also be distributed afterwards, so you can use the link that's given here. Thanks. All right, so what we actually did in order to find, let's say, try to quantify what the amount of extraction did on land subsidence is we created this 3D hydrogeological model, as we saw in the movie already. So it has a lot of geology in there. It was calibrated using measurements of hydrogeology and water levels. And we calculated compaction, subsidence compaction with a module that was connected to it. For your information, it was built in iMod, which is it's a shell from ModFlow, and it's open source and freely available to use as well. It's like an accelerated version of ModFlow by Deltaris. And when we did that, we could validate it using INSAR. So when we simulate these extractions, we see drawdown happening in actually most everywhere in all these aquifer systems. So it really creates a lot of decreasing pressure in this unconsolidated system. And here we see the simulation again that we also saw in the video. So on the left side, we see the hydraulic head in one of the aquifers gradually increasing since the 1990s. And on the right side, we see land subsidence cumulative for the entire model. So on the right spot in the upper corner, there's Ho Chi Minh City, which is a large city of 8 million people. And that's the city that starts to, let's say, compact and sink really fast first. And then in the 21st century, we really see that this delta also is starting to lose elevation and compact. So the extraction-induced land subsidence is accelerating, and we see that here. These are maps of 5 years each, and we see this increase really of compaction. And of course, this is driven by the increase of extraction. And interestingly, we could also confirm this by INSAR. So these are measurements done by satellite from space, and we had a data set from 2006 to 2010. And we also created a new one 10 years later. So first we had the model, and we actually saw from the model this acceleration. But then a few years later, we had this new data, and we saw actually this increase also now measured from space. So from 2 to 3 centimeters per year, the high rates in the delta went up to 5 to 6 centimeters per year. And groundwater exploitation was really happening in the entire delta. So future extraction-induced subsidence, what we then did when we had this model, you actually have the opportunity not to only study the past, but you can use it to project the future. So we created several scenarios of different extraction pathways, some of them in which we allow the amount of extraction to continue to grow, and some scenarios of mitigation where the amount of extraction is kept stable or reduced. And we have one scenario, M4, which is the scenario in which we completely stop all extractions. It's unrealistic, but it's we have it there to actually see how the system would respond. So feeding this into the model, we could then compute the hydraulic head for the different aquifers and the evolution in time, and the amount of land subsidence as a consequence of that. And as you can see, what is very important, especially when we talk to policymakers, is when we go to the scenario in which we completely stop all extractions, we see this increase in the hydraulic head, so recharge happens quite fast, but we still have ongoing compaction and land subsidence.
Later.
Sorry? Okay, and this is because of the ongoing compaction of these aquithards, because of the inequilibrium of pressure in the subsurface. So you stop the forcing, but still you will have land subsidence afterwards. So when we look to these different scenarios and we then combine it to a high resolution elevation map of this delta, we can project future elevations. So here we connected the extraction-induced land subsidence together with projections of sea level rise because of climate change and the local elevation of the sea. And in case of the mitigation scenario, in which we really cut back on the amount of extractions by 75%, this is the elevation trajectory of this delta. And you can see, as soon as we see blue appearing in this elevation map, it means that the elevation is below sea level. It doesn't mean necessarily flooded directly, because of course you can build flood protection systems, but it means below sea level, so it's much more expensive and much more difficult to maintain a good livelihood in those places. So that's when we really reduce extractions. When we keep the amount of extractions at the present day amount, then this is the trajectory. So in the second half of the century, we see actually that the majority of the delta is falling below sea level. So quite an extensive part. And then when we continue a moderate amount of extraction increase, and this is only 2% of increase per year, and actually the delta, because we simulated this in 2018, and we are a few years later, so the current trajectory is either B1 or B2 because the extractions are still increasing. Then this is what we see in terms of elevation. And towards the end of the century, the second half, large parts, let's say the majority of this delta is below sea level. So a key message is that the extraction of groundwater is not free. People do not pay for groundwater extraction in Vietnam, but not in the way of money. If you install a well, you can pump for free, but you do pay in an environmental way, because you pay with elevation and you pay also with increased salinization of your whole delta system. And in the end, those are really expensive costs, but they're very hidden. So this is a challenge, let's say, to communicate and convince people. One of the things that often happens, let's say, in workshops in the last couple of years is, at the end of the workshop, people start thinking about solutions, and then of course always this question comes up: can we maybe reinstate the flooding of rivers to compensate for elevation loss? And of course, this is the natural process that the delta built elevation. So maybe just reinstating that can restore and keep this elevation of the delta in place. So here we see that, and we actually started to, because this is, people are always, let's say, qualifying this, but never quantifying this. So together with a colleague, we set out to actually quantify this. So we designed certain sedimentation strategies and saw if it was effective or not to build and mitigate relative sea level rise. So we see that in the pristine delta, on the left-hand side, there's enough sediment for the delta to gain elevation, while on the right-hand side, in the present and the future situations, there's really not enough sediments coming from these different aspects to build elevation and compensate for the amount of land loss by land subsidence. So we designed different strategies, and I'm not going to go into the details further, but simply enough, there's not enough sediment to compensate for what's happening right now. So our research in Vietnam created a lot of impact, and it increased also the acceptance of the results. So it's been featured on the prime news, but also been presented to different ministries and discussed by bilateral meetings of the vice prime minister and the prime ministers of the Netherlands and Vietnam. So really a lot of things changed quite fast, and there's now a number of projects that big projects that really try to change the way groundwater is managed in this delta. So let's hope that will have a good effect in the very near future. And also, for example, this is the Mekong River Committee says, if the findings by Utrecht University are accurate, then there's a need for the scientific and governmental agencies to update all modeling works. And also the adaptation strategy and action plan needs to be implemented faster than we had planned. So people really were, let's say, inspired by our work that things had to change. Otherwise, things would really spiral out of control. So then the big question that we pose, for example, in Vietnam, will the Mekong Delta sink below sea level? Well, presently we see rates up to 6 centimeters per year. And often, well, if you look at the delta like this, you don't see any threat or any problem arising. But if we just go to another country close by, the Philippines, these areas that we see the pictures now, they used to have the same kind of agricultural fields only 20 years back. And they still lose elevation of about 5 centimeters per year. And as you can see, it's completely inundating these really large areas of the coast, completely, let's say, drowning villages and towns. So it is actually possible, quite environmentally, quite easily possible to drown large deltas. So today's actions determine the face of the delta tomorrow. Some conclusions before we wrap up. So land subsidence is partly caused by natural processes, but the majority, in the case of the Mekong Delta, is because of anthropogenic activities, and mainly the extraction of groundwater. And we see this tremendous increase in the last 2 decades, up to a magnitude larger than climate change-induced sea level rise. The delta is much lower elevated than previously thought. I didn't focus on that in this talk, but it's another finding we did. And the unrestricted groundwater extraction could drown large parts of this delta also within decades already, as you see. So just adapting to relative sea level rise is not a viable strategy. You really also need to mitigate and try to tackle these root causes, these anthropogenic root causes, in order to slow down and prevent future land subsidence. And in the case of the Mekong, the delta time or the elevation is really running out rapidly. So on a more general level, land subsidence in deltas and coastal areas, they can be highly variable in time and space. This is this 4D problem that I mentioned before. It has a strong link to anthropogenic land use and resources exploitation. Human-induced rates tend to be much faster than naturally induced processes. And dominant drivers and processes, they vary from delta to delta, but also within a single delta. So how to move forward and get grip on land subsidence in deltas? So present day subsidence rates are much higher than these global rates. Numerical models can be very powerful tools to study past, present, and the future. And they also help to communicate, let's say, knowledge to policymakers and provide, let's say, knowledge-based decision-making. Well, pathways and scenario modeling can be very effective, and it's a way to connect the socioeconomic system with the natural system that we know as earth scientists very well. And we need to adopt an inclusive delta system approach, so not stay within the single lanes of our single disciplines, but reach out, connect these disciplines together, and even reach out to other sectors and other disciplines like these socioeconomic systems if we want to have good future projections. And then the last slide that I'd like to share with you is, and it's already been introduced at the start. So we are now starting up a new project, which is called the Engulf Project, Coastal Land Subsidence in the Gulf of Guinea. And we're going to look at land subsidence in the coast in megacities and river deltas in your region. So objective 1 is to have a regional insight on coastal subsidence and relative sea level projections. So this is primarily focused on INSAR, so satellite-based observations for the coastal stretch running from Nigeria to Ivory Coast. Secondly, we're going to focus on Lagos as a case study because there's quite some, let's say, work already done on land subsidence in this city. And we want to move towards this 3D numerical modeling approach that I just showed for the Mekong Delta. The third one is we want to expand to other hotspots. This could be coastal cities, Nigeria, other countries as well, and river deltas. The aim is also to build a community of interest and a regional network on experts that work or want to work on land subsidence in West Africa. and with that community of interest, disseminate knowledge to policymakers and governments. So actually trying to bridge and help bridge the transfer of, let's say, scientific knowledge and understanding of the natural system to the policymakers who are, let's say, in charge of making decisions. And this is really something. It's quite a new subject, I think, in your region to study, but very important as you look to the, let's say, the projections of populations in Lagos, in other coastal cities. They're going sky high in the next decades, but it's very comparable to what we've seen in the past decades in these big Asian cities like Jakarta. So I think that if we can learn from those cases and try to, let's say, prevent certain negative aspects of that kind of growth in your region. So we're seeking research collaborations, and you're also very welcome to join this community of interest. And with that, I'd like to close off, and I thank you for your attention.
Okay. Wow. Thanks so very much, Philip. That presentation was very, very informative, educative. I really appreciate you. Thanks for that presentation. Now we go to question and answers. I believe we have some participants started asking questions, why the presentation was going on. And I'm going to read out those questions to us. The first question says, good presentation, but as the guest speaker considered the place of recharging of the subsurface water before the conclusion on over extraction. Probably I should allow you to answer that before I go to the next one, probably, or I should ask.
I can briefly respond to that. So
okay.
Thanks for that question. So the amount of recharge is actually computed inside this model, this hydrogeological model. And what you can see, let's say from the measurement time series, we have time series that span 25 years, is that this consequent decrease of pressure really points towards, let's say, a lack of recharge in quantification. So the amount of extraction is higher than the amount of recharge. So these are not observations from an active extraction well. So it's not a depression cone created while actively extracting water, but it's simply measuring the pressure in the aquifer. So it is in that sense different from, it's not a pumping test or something. It really shows that the extraction over exceeds the amount of recharge happening in this system.
Okay, thank you very much. I can see someone raising up his hand. Maruf Adabanija, please can you ask your question before we go to the next question?
Yes, thank you so much, Philip, for your presentation. Very educative and a lot of enthusiasm. Now, I have about 2 questions. First off, I joined the presentation late anyway because of the network. Why considering the over extraction and lab subsidence? Did you take into consideration anthropogenic activity like sand mining? Like for instance, in Lagos, this is one of the things that is aiding the subsidence, sand mining. And I saw that you have included Lagos in your feature study. That's the first question. The second question goes thus. At what point did the depression really started? Before coming to the depression, the coning effect, what is the threshold point at which that subsidence begins? That would be very interesting because you have used numerical modeling, and that would be interesting to know what actually happened, the pathway, and what you have spoken about. At what point did the coning really got, collapsed, and then begin to experience the subsidence?
Thank you very much for these 2 questions. So first, the point on the sand mining. So the what you see in the river system when there's sand mining going on, it causes this, let's say, the collapse of riverbanks. So basically river erosion. And these are these episodic events of, let's say, a landslide collapsing in the river. And I know that also this process is sometimes referred to as land subsidence. So is that indeed what you mean, that the connection between sand mining and this type of, let's say, local elevation loss?
Maruf, that question is for you. I think it's
Yeah.
Is Maruf still there?
Okay. Well, let's say I know that that's a fact, right? That's a connection that's often been seen, but it's a different type of land subsidence than what we studied. So we didn't study these very local processes connected to rivers and to sand mining and deepening and riverbank erosion, but we were interested in, let's say, this huge delta of several hundreds of kilometers and the compaction happening in this deep surface. So it's not episodic failure of slopes, but it's connected to compaction in the subsurface that gradually lowers the surface level. The second thing is on the threshold of when land subsidence happens. Maybe to try to understand your question, I think that if you talk about land subsidence in reservoirs, so if you go deep into the hard rock and you talk about oil and gas exploitation, then of course these reservoirs, because they're situated in hard rock, they have a much higher threshold before they start to collapse and subside. But if we are in this unconsolidated zone, there's not a lot of threshold going on. So it is more or less as soon as the water pressure reaches a new low, and this can be even only several decimeters, the process of compaction already starts in these fine-grained layers. So there's not a big gap to overcome in terms of thresholds there. It's more a really tightly connected process. But of course, there is this delay in time because the pressure propagation in these clays can be very slow. So it can take several years in order to, let's say, speed up this process of compaction.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. I believe that has been answered. I believe Morocco is satisfied with that response. Okay, there is a question here. It says, do you apply INSAR technique in measuring fatigue displacement? How reliable is this technique?
Yes, so we use INSAR. I don't process INSAR myself, so let's put that first in the front row, because I think INSAR is really an expert, a different expertise that you need to be well trained in order to use properly. Even though it can be done open source these days, you have to be really careful because you can get all sorts of outcomes. But we collaborate with other people who are experts on this, and they produce INSAR. And how accurate is it? If INSAR is produced well and you have local benchmark to verify your results, then at least what we see for the Mekong Delta is that the accuracy is about 4 to 5 millimeters per year. So that's the level of noise that we see in these measurements. So if you have compaction that is less than that amount, it is hard to distinguish movement from noise. And this is in the tropical setting of the Mekong Delta. If we go to more, let's say, higher latitudes, for example, in the Netherlands, it can be reduced to 1 or 2 millimeters because we have less soil moisture, less atmospheric distortion, and a better control of background data. But in these kind of tropical settings with not a lot of let's say, background data, I would say accuracy is about 5 millimeters. And beyond that, you will get a trustworthy signal.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Then there's another question here. The question says, what of erosion? That is, I think the first question was asking about over extraction, but this one is talking about erosion. Does erosion has anything to do with subsidence? Does it have a place in the whole concept, maybe as one of the driver of land subsidence, especially in a tropical setting like Nigeria?
Well, erosion has, in that sense, it's a downstream link to land subsidence. As you can imagine, that if you lose elevation in, for example, the coastal zone, then also coastal processes like coastal erosion, they tend to increase simply because the water level is higher. You have more energetic conditions, so that tends to increase erosion, let's say, quite significantly. So it is one of the connections that we see, at least in the Mekong, also this connection between, of course, elevation loss and increased coastal erosion and coastal retreat. So that is one. And of course, another link that you have is, but then we go more into, let's say, this whole system of connected processes. When you have erosion at a certain point, you create sediment. And if you don't lose the sediment to the sea, but you're able to, let's say, get it in a different place and be sedimentated in another place, it is, of course, let's say, it could build up elevation in another place. So there's another connection between erosion, sedimentation, and land subsidence and elevation.
Okay, thank you for that response. Then I have another question here. That's coming from Moruf Adabanija. If river sedimentation could not compensate for the subsidence, then theory of isostasy does not hold in such delta. What is your take on this?
Let me think about this. So if the theory of isostasy does not hold, I don't see why it does not hold. Marufdin, could you explain your question?
Okay, Moruf, please can you unmute yourself and try to probably speak on your question.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Clearly.
Normally, when such a process takes place, the theory of isostasy should come to play. When there is a erosion somewhere, that means there must be deposition elsewhere. So that is what I mean by that isostasy, and that is the concept of that theory. So if this river sedimentation cannot fully compensate for that subsidence, that is something else. Something else is must have been happening somewhere else. If you consider the material balance, look at the material balance point of view as well. That means there is some imbalance somewhere, and that I feel personally that could be responsible for that imbalance for river sedimentation and that subsidence. And that's why I put up that question. That means for such delta, isostasy does not really hold. That's the implication. Unless you're able to account for what is responsible for it.
Yeah,
hello.
Hello. Yeah, it's not yet completely clear to me what the.
I hope you understand what is meant by isostasy, the theory of isostasy.
Please, can you explain?
Isostasy, I've explained that. I've used a simple concept to explain what is meant by isostasy. That is when there is erosion somewhere, there must be disposition elsewhere to balance the effect of that. So that is what isostasy means strictly. That's the concept. And I try to relate it to what he has just said, that river sedimentation could not compensate for that subsidence. That means something must have happened somewhere as well. If that could not take place, maybe, for instance, like I said, I did not join the presentation very early. Maybe something like a problem like maybe climate change, fluctuating sea level rises or whatever. There should be something must have happened somewhere. That is my concern. If that sedimentation cannot actually compensate for that subsidence in that delta region.
Yes, so let's say in a natural setting without human disturbance, there is enough sediment available, of course, and that's also how this delta grew in the last several thousands of years. Right, there was enough sediment to compensate, let's say, natural processes like isostasy, tectonics. Of course, it's a delta, so it's situated in a, let's say, geologically sinking basin, creating, let's say, over geological timescales, accommodations. So that's why this delta can form there. That's why we have this thick stack of unconsolidated sediments. But these processes, they also act on a much longer timescale. So I think you are right. Let's say that there are, of course, interactions with isostasy, but they play, I think, on a much longer time scale than what we see in these internal, let's say, processes in these unconsolidated sediments, especially when we have now this high, let's say, disturbance by humans that really make this imbalance in the system. So, and in that sense, you're right. The whole system right now is in equilibrium, and it will find a new equilibrium in, let's say, if we don't do anything, but it will take a long time, especially connected to geological processes. Of course, this will be something for millennium timescale, etc.
Okay, but Philip, before I go to the next question, when you look at subsidence or probably river sedimentation in the delta, there are a lot of factors, especially from the anthropogenic effect, the damming that disallow sediment from coming towards the coast.
Exactly.
But I believe, I think what Maruf said about isostasy does not actually, it's not actually the right term to use, because isostasy has to do with the rising and setting of a portion of the Earth's lithosphere. And basically it has to probably when the ice is melting, and then the Earth will be able to rebound again. Probably, I think that theory may not actually be applicable when it comes to river sedimentation. But I believe that a lot of factors that may be responsible when it comes.
I disagree. I quite disagree with you. Isostasy is a concept that holds anywhere. It's not. That's the way you have said it is another concept. It's another concept. That is part of isostasy. So okay. You can't say it's not applicable to this scenario.
Okay, thank you very much.
Isostasy holds everywhere. It goes everywhere.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's quickly ask this question. What could be the impact of the current Atlantic City project in Lagos on the rate of subsidence? I wouldn't know if Philip actually know what knows about the Atlantic City. Atlantic City is like a big project that we have in Lagos, Nigeria. And it's just like reclamation of the ocean, part of the ocean that has been eroded. So it's just like you are trying to create a kind of a artificial peninsula. You are trying to reclaim part of those land that has been taken by the ocean. So, and this question is now, is asking, Dr. Charles is asking, what could be the impact of the current Atlantic City project, that is like sand filling of the ocean, part of the ocean, is being recovered, that has been taken by the ocean is being recovered again. So, and the city is being built on this reclaimed land. So it's asking what could be the implication or the impact of this Atlantic City project in Lagos on the rate of subsidence.
Exactly. So if I understand correctly, it is, let's say, reclamation of land by sand filling and creating new islands, let's say. So in these kind of projects, there's, let's say, of course, what happens when you create new land with sediment, these sediments, they compact themselves over time. And also if it's purely sand, there's also some, let's say, compaction, especially in the first years. So we see that with landfills elsewhere in the world, or for example, often used for airports that are situated offshore, that they tend to have high compaction rates, and they can sink several centimeters per year. So, but this should be known in the design. So if you design this, you should really compute and account for this amount of elevation loss. So basically create more elevation so you can lose it in the next decades because of this compaction process. So that's one. Secondly, if you build them, if you allow to have new settlements and cities on these places, one, as we see in this talk, for example, the question is, where is the water coming from? So are they using piped water supply from the mainland? Then, of course, the subsurface may not be impacted by in this case, groundwater extraction. If there is groundwater extraction, then all processes that we just discussed will take place in these offshore places as well, because this delta is of course not stopping at the boundary of the sea, but these layers, they continue below the seafloor. So also there we have aquifers and aqueducts that are, let's say, created during ice age conditions with much lower sea levels. So you have basically subsurface delta that can compact in the same way as surface, let's say, exposed deltas can. So that is really would be a main concern in case of such a project. And of course, then you have also the other, take into account the other aspects of land subsidence, more deep-rooted aspects, and maybe some of the, let's say, the loading effects of this landfill on the lying sediments simply. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Dr. Diba, please, isostasy does not hold in this scenario. Okay, thank you very much for that contribution. Then I go to the next one. I think this is from, okay, I'm sorry, I'm trying to, okay, isostasy is the depth of compensation, hence it may apply to the, okay, thank you very much for your contribution. There's a question here, and the recovery, okay, that is coming from Dr. Charles Oyelaki. And the recovery is coming from taking sand from ocean. Okay, it's trying to buttress his question that because the reclamation is actually you have taken sand from the ocean to reclaim the land, you know, that has already been taken over by the ocean. So, so it's trying to buttress that the recovery is coming from the taking of sand from the ocean. That is, there is a mega dredging that is taking place. That's section of Lagos. Probably in your work on Lagos, probably you may have to look at this also, to look at that artificial peninsula that is being created, you know, over there in Lagos.
It's very interesting, but it's also very comparable to, if you compare to the city of Jakarta. So they have had and maybe still have these projects of reclamation islands in front of the city. So they started that, I think, 20 years back. 15. So they have created really new peninsulas with high-rise buildings into the sea. But because of the ongoing groundwater extraction, also these landfills, they now are really suffering from a high rate of land subsidence. So they're not that future-proof in that sense. So you really have to be very careful of what happens in your subsurface. All these contributing factors, of course, when you plan this kind of projects, and I hope that that's been taken into account, but that sometimes is not the case if you look to the Jakarta case. So it's really something to, in that sense, to be mindful on.
Okay, thank you very much. It's like we don't have much questions. For me, I have a question. Then focusing on Nigeria, as you know, that in your presentation, you talked about groundwater exploitation, but aside from groundwater exploitation in Nigeria, crude oil, which is coming from the subsurface, is actually being exploited. Do you think we may likely have a problem?
Yeah, so you talk about the oil extraction, correct? Yeah. Oh, yes, well, that's another, let's say, fluid that when you extract it, you can cause compaction, of course. And that is definitely happening, and it's definitely a thing on the process scale. And I cannot imagine that it would not play a role in Nigeria, given the vast extent of oil extraction. In terms of rates, it is, because it's deeper rooted, it's often let's say, if you compare it to the super high rates of groundwater extraction, it is often, let's say, lower in terms of how much land subsidence it can cause. But for sure, it will cause compaction of these deeper reservoirs, and that will then eventually also create land subsidence at the surface. So it's definitely, in the case of Nigeria, I think it's an important factor. If you try to unravel the total elevation change and compaction land subsidence, then of course the extraction of fossil fuels is definitely one of the factors to include. Also knowing that it's probably a very sensitive topic, because it's often not popular to point at that, let's say, side effect of oil extraction. But for sure, from a scientific point of view, this is an important factor.
Okay, thank you very much. And then of recent, we'll be having issues with building collapsing, especially in Lagos. There was a serious one, I think, towards the end of last year, almost about 21 or 11-story building collapsed. Do you think it has something to do with subsidence?
I mean, yeah, it could be, but it can be, let's say, connected to of course a number of aspects. In principle, when you have land subsidence, you don't have one-on-one collapsing buildings. It also depends on how the buildings are constructed, of course. But I'm not a specialist on let's say building construction in that sense. But what you can have, if you have high rates of land subsidence, is high rates of what we call differential land subsidence. So it's the difference in compaction on small distances between buildings and between unfounded buildings and founded buildings. And maybe that can contribute also to collapse of certain structures. That could be. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's like we're having some questions here. Please just bear with us. Okay, please can the presentation be shared? Sure. What you just need to do, make your email available to us, and then we get it across to you. Thank you. And then there's this question is asking, we love to have it. Okay, great works to you guys. Okay, yeah. And then this is coming. This has been carried out in a sedimentary environment. Can similar phenomenon occur in hard rock basement environment, maybe with thick overburden? It's asking that, is it possible for one to have subsidence, land subsidence in basement hard rock environment? Do you think?
Certainly, yeah. But then you arrive to, let's say, the realm of more the tectonics and isostasy, so these earth crust dynamics. But certainly also, let's say, the hard rock subsurface is in that sense a living body. So you can have collapses of karstic limestone rocks, or well, if you extract oil or gas, you can cause these kind of processes also in hard rock domains. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. We really appreciate your coming for honoring this invitation. We have really, we have really gained from your presentation of today. So we are very, very grateful for you coming around. And I wouldn't know if the chairman of the Nigerian Mining and Geosciences Society, Ibadan chapter, we have something to say before we end this. Dr. Adebe.
Thank you, Vice Chair. I want to thank Philip for a good job, for opening our eyes to imminent and the long-term effect of these unmitigated, land subsidence. What I can derive from this presentation is that most of the work that he's doing is on the unconsolidated part of the subsurface. It's a shallow thing, and that's why the issue of isostacy and what have you look confusing. By the time you are dealing with isostacy, you are talking of a deep-rooted event. that will actually, affect the entire geologic setting. But this is a shallow setting, and he has opened our eyes to it, and I believe is a clarion call for the coastal areas. And I want to thank you because of the knowledge that you have shared with us this afternoon. And I want to believe that when we call you again, you will be willing to come and make another, presentation on your findings. And by the time you actually come to Lagos, Nigeria will be willing to assist in any way you want us to, to come to your aid. Thank you once again on behalf of the chapter and the executive for coming up to make our presentation. This is the first presentation anyway, and we have enjoyed it. And I want to believe that subsequently, more people will join us. I can see some people from Wari. I can see Faith Omairabo. I know he's from Delta State, and I think I saw one other guy from that area too. You're welcome. And round up, and then we call it quit. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these great words, and thanks for this opportunity again and your time of everyone.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to hopefully meet you in the future and perhaps collaborate on this subject indeed, because I think you have a lot of knowledge also to offer, which can help us to create better, let's say, research for the city of Lagos, in this case, where we're going to look at first. So please, if you are interested, also reach out to me and to us, and I will do the same when we are up and running with the project. And I hope I'll be able to come to Lagos also in the future. So thank you very much. And,
thank you so much.
Hope to see you again.
Okay, thanks. Alaji Ghana, thank you. I can see you. You're welcome. That's from all the way from Nasarawa.
Great.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Philip. And I want to appreciate everyone that have attended today's lecture. We are very, very grateful for being part of this historical lecture. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Okay, Philip, my regards to your family. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Bye.